Death is always on the way. But the fact that you don't know when it will arrive seems to take away from the finiteness of life. It's that terrible precision that we hate so much. But because we don't know, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. Yet everything happens only a certain number of times. A very small number, really. How many times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood? Some afternoon that's so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it. Perhaps 4 or 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless. Hey, this is Nathan.
And this is David. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. On this episode, we're reading Paul Bowles' 1949 novel, The Sheltering Sky. It's a novel of stark, poetic, and philosophical prose that follows Port and Kit Moresby, an American couple traveling in North Africa just after World War II. Their journey devolves into sickness, death, existential despair, and madness. Or, to use a quote from the author himself, everything gets worse.
To me, thinking about this book, I can't help but compare it to the other books that we've read or typically read, and this seems like something of a departure, and it kind of sits outside of a lot of literature in my mind, because at its root, or at on one reading, it's an adventure story. There's an exoticness, an inherent exoticness to it, and there's a sort of pleasure in the exoticism. And, this is maybe not in vogue now. It's a East Coast American going to a foreign country and writing about the people there as very much, on the one hand, is very much an outsider, even though Paul Bowles spent 50 years or something at the end of his life living in Morocco or living in North Africa. But the fact that it can be enjoyed at that, just the pleasure of travel adventure, stood out to me initially.
I don't know if I would read it as a travel adventure. I mean, it involves travel and adventure, but it's a dark travel adventure, and it's kind of a hopeless one. Whereas or at least the word travel adventure evokes in my mind like exploration and curiosity. Maybe the author has that and it comes across in the prose, but the characters don't have that. Which I think
that's
is
my
a
feeling
critique of a certain type of person that the author is making, right?
Yeah. And I enjoy that contrast, because like you said, the characters themselves never seem quite able to access the place that they are. They're looking for that real, authentic experience. They're looking for that escape, and they don't find it. And I think anybody who's traveled in a foreign country for very long can empathize with that feeling. Eventually, you just realize that you're just carrying yourself around, and you can't get away from that.
Yeah. It's the famous Yogi Berra quote.
Yeah.
No matter where you go, there you are.
Exactly. That sums it up. But at the same time, and I think this also makes the book interesting and compelling, in my opinion, in a way that is different from, other existential literature, Camus, or, writers of that type, is the author. I feel his fascination with the region, even as bad things are happening, as the characters are devolving into madness. There's something incredibly beautiful about the place that's happening. The Sahara isn't just this destructive force. It's sublime. It's sublimely destructive. And I think Bowles holds both of those things, as sort of that it can be beautiful and terrifying, and these characters are being totally destroyed by these, by their situation.
I think you're right at at labeling it sublime and like the romantic old school version of being terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And it is absolutely that. And it's often described that way by both Bowles's prose and sometimes the characters in their own narrative. Port himself will often describe the world around him. I mean, the title of the book comes from him describing this fear that he feels when looking out at the sky. And he'll often want to escape into that Sahara. There's a quote. Kit and Port are talking, and Kit says, "Sunset is such a sad hour." And then Port, "If I watch the end of a day any day, I always feel it's the end of a whole epoch. And the autumn, it might as well be the end of everything," he said. "That's why I hate cold countries and love the warm ones, where there's no winter, and when night comes you feel an opening up of the life there instead of a closing down. Don't you feel that?" "Yes," said Kit, "but I'm not sure I prefer the warm countries. I don't know. I'm not sure I don't feel that it's wrong to try to escape the night and winter. And what if you do, you'll have to pay for it somehow." Which is a weird little hint at what's to come later. And then it made her sad to realize that in spite of their so often having the same reactions, the same feelings, they never would reach the same conclusions because their respective aims in life were almost diametrically opposed. They sat down on the rocks side by side, facing the vastness below. She linked her arm through his and rested her head against his shoulder. He only stared straight before him, sighed, and finally shook his head slowly. It was such places as this, such moments that he loved above all else in life. She knew that, and she also knew that he loved them more if she could be there to experience them with him. And although he was aware that the very silences and emptinesses that touched his soul terrified her, he could not bear to be reminded of that. It was as if always he held the fresh hope that she too would be touched in the same way as he by solitude and the proximity to infinite things. He had often told her, "It's your only hope," and she was never sure what he meant. Sometimes she thought he meant that it was his only hope, that only if she were able to become as he was, could he find his way back to love, since love for Port meant loving her. Shit. Sorry, man. I don't know if this is actually related to what we want to talk about.
I don't know, but this is a great quote. No, keep going. Keep going. I'm enjoying this quote.
Okay.
I think there's a lot to unpack here.
So he had often told her, "It is your only hope," and she was never sure what he meant. Sometimes she thought he meant that it was his only hope, that only if she were able to become as he was could he find his way back to love, since love for Port meant loving her. There was no question of anyone else. And now for so long there had been no love, no possibility of it. But in spite of her willingness to become whatever he wanted her to become, she could not change that much. The terror was always there inside her, ready to take command. It was useless to pretend otherwise. And just as she was unable to shake off the dread that was always with her, he was unable to break out of the cage into which he had shut himself, the cage he had built long ago to save himself from love. I thought this quote was much more about the nature that they were in, and it's only briefly mentioned. But this happens at a moment, I think it's in chapter 13, when the two of them kind of go out into the desert by themselves at night. It's a really beautiful whole chapter. And they're up on the rocks. And there's like a praying man next to them, and they're staring out into the vastness. And I think just after this is when there's the quote that gets at the title of the novel, where he talks about being terrified of what's beyond the sky. "You know," said Port. His voice sounded unreal, as voices are likely to do after a long pause in an utterly silent spot. "The sky here is very strange. I often have the sensation when I look at it that it's a solid thing up there, protecting us from what's behind." Kit shuddered slightly as she said, "From what's behind?" "Yes, but what is behind?" Her voice was very small. "Nothing, I suppose. Just darkness, absolute night." "Please don't talk about it now." There was agony in her entreaty. "Everything you say frightens me up here. It's getting dark, and the wind is blowing, and I can't stand it." And then they get up to leave, and You know what? He said with great earnestness. I think we're both afraid of the same thing. And for the same reason, we've never managed, either one of us, to get all the way into life. We're hanging on to the outside for all we're worth, convinced we're going to fall off at the next bump. Isn't that true? And then she doesn't answer and they move on. Yeah, before we were recording, you were talking about one of your favorite chapters of the book, and I think this one is one of mine. This is, chapter 13. Because it's one of the few moments where you see Kit and Port interacting in a way that shows that they care about each other, but it also gets at, I think, the existential dread that sort of moves throughout this novel behind all of the romantic images and the traveling, and eventually catches up to the death and everything in the end.
They're both beautiful passages. And to kind of bring it back to the relation to nature and this sort of the sublime, and the two characters kind of relationship with that, and then the relationship with each other. I mean, that's kind of, those are the three main characters, right? I guess it's Kit, Port, and then the vastness of the world around them, and then what lays beyond that, which is death, I suppose. But is it dreadful? The journey is interesting to me. It's kind of this linear path from civilization, which happens just before the book starts. They land in North Africa, and this linear progression deeper and deeper and deeper into the desert, away from Europeanization, trying to get to some idea of the Sahara. What is it? You said it's dreadful, and obviously, and then we started
dreadful to me as a reader, maybe not necessarily to the characters at times. I think there is a mad giddiness with which Port and Kit seek to obliterate themselves or escape into the Sahara, which seems to be this idea of remoteness, isolation, nothingness, whatever. Fill in your metaphor. Is that what you're getting at by saying is it dreadful or not?
Yeah, and I think in existential literature, there's this feeling of dread, this feeling of that it's meaningless, and I think that one way to, or that there's no meaning out there to attain. And I think one way to read this is that way. I mean, these characters, one, spoiler alert, he dies, and she kind of goes insane. So on the one hand, okay, well, that's losing. That's you get to the edge. As you approach this isolation, you lose at life. That's bad. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to read this. They approach isolation. They leave behind society, community, their friends. I think they're constantly trying to get away from Tunner. Is a kind of a great, Tunner represents the common person, the normal person.
Yeah, he seems like a very average guy. And watching Kit and Port project all of their baggage and insecurities into this guy who's just pretty lackadaisical and kind of a typical traveler. I mean, he's a bit pompous. He's a bit goofy. He's horny.
Yeah.
But he doesn't strike me as like an evil person necessarily, or a bad person, or in any way. But
no, and I think he's a tether back to civilization. Yeah. He's not trying to lose himself in the Sahara.
No.
He's not trying to obliterate himself. He's
just traveling.
I mean, he's trying to get with Kit. And he's just trying to, he finds these two people very strange and interesting, and somehow that they seem to access something he doesn't have access to. So he's kind of, observing them in order to have this experience. But he's there for the experience, presumably to return to New York.
Yeah.
And Kit and Port are both there, kind of with this subconscious feeling that they're not going to return.
Yeah, he's what Port would describe as a tourist, not a traveler.
Yes.
So early in the book, Port, this is the narrative, he did not think of himself as a tourist. He was a traveler. The difference is partly one of time, he would explain. Whereas the tourist generally hurries back home at the end of a few weeks or months, the traveler, belonging no more to one place than to the next, moves slowly over periods of years, from one part of the earth to another, and then just in the next paragraph. For, as he claimed, another important difference between tourist and traveler is that the former accepts his own civilization without question, not so the traveler, who compares it with the others, and rejects those elements he finds not to his liking.
Is that that's Port's quote, right? He's
Well,
saying that.
yeah, this is like the narrative, and we can get into the prose, does this thing where it kind of slips into a character's mind and describes it and then slips out without necessarily quoting them.
Mm.
Although the quote that you read at the beginning is a direct quote, but it's from Kit remembering something that Port said. Whereas this is just kind of slipping into the narrative, right? And the book does this in an odd way. Like the opening chapter makes you feel like you're always going to be stuck in the third person, but in a limited view with Port. And then the very next, I think it's the very next chapter, jumps to describing viewing Port and Kit and Tunner, but like from a much more distant third person narrative.
Yeah, that confused me at first because he describes them as three people at a table,
Exactly. Right. It's really
kind of
a unique
anonymously.
way of approaching narrative structure and narrative technique.
And then he does that at several key points throughout the novel too. When they first arrive at Bonura or something like that in the desert, and then most of the chapter is about the lieutenant and the lieutenant's troubles with the native people there and his
Yeah, right.
marital life, and then suddenly Port shows up with a dilemma and how that affects the lieutenant. I really liked the way that Bowles does that at key moments to kind of like shine a different light, kind of highlight a different aspect of the
Yeah, I think it's
characters.
interesting. We got sidetracked. I don't know what we were talking about.
uh, well, let's. I was talking about what is this journey? What
Oh,
different ways to read the journey, but maybe we can.
I kind of want to stick on tourist and traveler just for a bit. When you talked about Bowles' writing of the Sahara, so when I first started the book, I was somewhat concerned that this was going to be some sort of not this is a common narrative, but certainly a common thing that you experience when you meet other travelers when you're out traveling, and that's the idea of, and I think I mentioned in the notes there, romantic primitivism. Are you
Mm.
familiar with this term, this
Mm-hmm.
idea? And so I thought we were going to get this thing of like, oh, these are, privileged Western travelers who are very anti-Western. They view it all as corrupt and evil. And so they look to these indigenous other populations and they romanticize them in some way. But you don't actually get that.
Yeah, and there's a quote right near the beginning where Port kind of addresses that. For years, it had been one of his superstitions that reality and true perception were to be found in the conversation of the laboring classes. Even though now he saw clearly that their formulas of thought and speech are as strict and as patterned, and thus as far removed from any profound expression of truth as those of any other class. Often he found himself still in the act of waiting, with the unreasoning belief that gems of wisdom might yet issue from their mouths.
And he kind of suffers from this, even though he acknowledges it, that it's kind of false. He still suffers from it in the book, right? I think just a few pages later, he talks about how, and this is a quote, the odors in the air grew even stronger. They were varied, but they all represented filth of one sort of another. The proximity with, as it were, a forbidden element served to elate him. And there's a few instances of this where like there's elation and exaltation in otherness. and anything that's definitely removed from what he views as I think early on it's referred to as the mechanized world, or mechanized age, I think is what it is. It's like an element of Port, but he's too selfish and self-involved to really even view other people and other cultures in that way. So I think it's a relief that that's not a part of what the book is, even though it kind of sets it up as what these people might actually be. And so it saves it from that trap by becoming something totally different.
That's something that I appreciate about Bowles in this and in his short stories. He writes about, sort of exotic locations in this book, North Africa. He writes about South America and Native Americans and different things. And, you could contest whether this is fair or accurate, but he's not romanticizing these people. I think he's using this feeling that maybe we all have of the exotic, of the distant, of the other, to pull out emotions from ourselves, to take us to a place that is frightening, to take us to a place where we feel vulnerable. But these people are not different from us in that regard. The other is not different from us. The other, there's elements of the good and the evil in the other as well. And I think the way that he writes about his Western characters, they are extremely flawed in the way that they see the native populations. Like, I think, like, throughout this, I find Port's hypocrisy kind of delicious. How he sees himself in this elevated way as a traveler, as a philosopher, as pursuing something, rejecting the West and pursuing something pure. And at the same time, he has such disdain for the local population.
Oh, yeah.
At times he hardly sees them as people, as hardly sees them as deserving the same privileges that he enjoys.
No. His main interactions that you see are instances of prostitution, trying to turn one of them into a prostitute, kicking them off of buses so that he can get a seat, to escape having to interact with another Westerner. Yeah, he's a horrible person. But at the same time, there is a recognition of anyone who has felt the nothingness of the world around them and wanted something else. That drive, you recognize that in yourself, and you recognize that in Port, even if everything else he's doing is somewhat abysmal. And when he's dying, I guess you have sympathy for him.
But I think that there's also, and maybe I'm unique in this regard, but I understand that selfishness too. Like,
if you're honest with yourself,
I think we all are somewhat selfish. I care about myself, and then trying to have the awareness to recognize, like, when you are selfish or we're selfish. And I think that to take it back to, we're talking about this journey into the Sahara and this journey into isolation, one thing that Port doesn't seem to reconcile with himself in his pursuit of some purifying force. It seems to be he's trying to purify himself in this journey towards oblivion, that he doesn't see himself as that selfish person. He doesn't see, the misery that he's putting other people in. And I don't think that it's right to read Bowles in a moralistic way. I don't think Bowles saw himself as a moralist. Maybe he actually saw himself as a nihilist. He lived a very isolated life in North Africa for reasons. But at the same time, I almost can't help but read that morality into this, that you're pursuing something pure at the expense of other human beings. That is hell. That is annihilation of what makes life worth living. And it's a strange maybe connection to make, but it reminded me of C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, which is a sort of philosophical, not quite a novel, kind of spiritual metaphor. That's very similar. It's kind of these. It tells a story of someone who's traveling toward in this sort of fantastical realm, in either traveling towards love or traveling towards isolation. And depending on which path you choose, you find yourself in heaven or you find yourself in hell. And even like ending up in the Sahara where it's so hot, where the sun is just steel heat. That's kind of not dissimilar from, fire and brimstone itself.
Yeah. The thing about Port is he does recognize that selfishness. There's an interaction he has with Tunner and Kit, and he says, "Europe has destroyed the whole world," said Port. "Should I be thankful to it and sorry for it? I hope the whole place gets wiped off the map." He wanted to cut short the discussion, to get Kit aside and talked with her privately. Their long, rambling, supremely personal conversations always made him feel better. But she hoped particularly to avoid such a tete-a-tete. "Why don't you extend your good wishes to all humanity while you're at it?" she demanded. "Humanity?" cried Port. "What's that? Who is humanity? I'll tell you. Humanity is everyone but oneself. So of what interest can it possibly be to anybody?" Tunner said slowly, Wait a minute. I'd like to take issue with you on that. I'd say humanity is you, and that's just what makes it interesting." "Good, Tunner," cried Kit. Port was annoyed. "What rot," he snapped. "You're never humanity. You're only your own poor, hopelessly isolated self."
And is that him recognizing his? Well, he recognizes, or he believes in the nature of selfishness, but not maybe by describing selfishness as the inherent natural state. He kind of excuses himself from having to deal with the harm that he's causing others and himself.
He's excuse making by saying, all I have is myself, so why should I care about anything and anyone else? But also at the same time, it's funny that the narrator anyway, and acknowledges through Port that he likes having these conversations with Kit one-on-one. And he often, like the quote earlier I mentioned about how the only way he could return to love would be through realizing that he loves Kit. So he knows that he's connected to someone. And you see it too when he's dying. When he's dying, he reaches out for her, even though he can't see, he reaches out for her twice. The first time he's reaching for her, she acknowledges, she sees that he's trying to get a hold of her hand and make connection in his dying moments, and she refuses him, which is really dark. Eventually she relents and allows him to touch her one last time. So you say you can't help but reading the morality in that, and I think there's something in it that you see Port's destruction and where it leads.
It's so powerful.
It is.
I mean, I feel convicted by that, really. And I think this morality reminds me of House of Leaves. And this, at the very abstract level, it's like you're pursuing something external. You want to access reality. You want to touch reality. And it feels like it's so important that somehow you touch reality. If that's, why does this house keep growing? Or if that's somewhere out in the dunes of the Sahara, but you can't touch reality. You can only touch each other. And if you refuse to touch the one that you love, or if you place that beneath, it's like, well, first I'll have tea in the Sahara. First I'll go do this thing. I'll go learn about reality. It's going to be too late.
Yeah. You keep looking for that perfect vantage point in which to enjoy your tea, and you end up bones in the desert sand. Like the tale that what's her name tells. I can't remember. Not the blind lady.
Dancer,
yeah.
Yes, I mean it's interesting. That's why I kind of have issue with the idea that this is nihilistic, personally.
Like the overall novel is nihilistic?
That I've read the novel that Bowles' stories, that people find them nihilistic. And I think maybe because of they're harsh. I mean, I think there's a merciless quality to them, like you said, when like good doesn't triumph. And I think there's not a silver lining. It's not like, well, we learned a lesson. Like sometimes everything goes wrong. Port doesn't make it out. He doesn't recover. He could have. I think that's tragic. It's like he could have.
I think that's what makes it a good tragedy, is that the lesson, if there's a moral lesson to be learned, it's in the tragedy of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no moral lesson that the characters learn necessarily.
Right. I think that's maybe what irks some people, is that the characters don't experience that arc. I mean, I'm just projecting. I just in reading other descriptions of his works, and I think maybe it was in the intro to his short stories when they were talking about it, because his short stories can be quite brutal and dark, very dark. But I think even in that darkness, there's a type of darkness that in which there is no light, and then there's a type of darkness that seems to illuminate a light. And I think that his writings that I've read, they're dark and they're bleak, but by focusing on the shadows, it reveals a light. And that's what I find beautiful about his stories and his writing.
So what kind of light do you see here then?
I mean, I think there's the beauty of nature. Like it's not, I think he has an acute, the author, Bowles, has an acute awareness that comes through in the writing. And that acute awareness is inspiring. It's inspiring to go walk around and feel, what does that breeze look like? Look, what does that sun look like? Because he captures it. And it took me back to like traveling. I was like, oh man, I wish I had written that down, because you walk through that alley and suddenly the temperature changes and there's a breeze. I'm like, I've been in that alley. He doesn't even have to go into detail. I know what that feeling is.
That's funny, man. I had the same thought. They made me pick up old notebooks I had from traveling and just go, oh yeah, that's right.
I think that element is like, that's a light. And it's a remind, you see the darkness of the characters or the ignorance or the cruelty of the characters, but against the backdrop of the author, revealing the qualities of the environment. And I think that's, you feel that contrast. And then I think the other one is that the sort of morality of it, the pursuing that idea, that philosophy, that, that mission at the expense of love of those around you. In his dying moment, was he regretful that he didn't have tea in the Sahara? Or did he reach out and not be able to touch the one person who could save him? It's like and I feel that. It's like, I think at some level, I recognize that. And so that's sort of a reminder to, where to place your priorities in a way that puts things in the right order.
If there's light to be found, and I think there is, it's in those two things. But it involves the reader putting in an effort for that. Because like you said, I think you can read this superficially as a travel adventure gone horribly wrong, or you can read this totally as a nihilistic view of not necessarily humanity, but of maybe of all humanity, that in the end we are alone, and we're going to end up
alone, selfish, cruel, and we will die alone.
Yeah, that's true. There's no obvious redeeming quality in any of the characters, really. I mean, granted, we only really get perspectives from the Western travelers or the French colonial overlords, because this does take place in still French colonial Africa.
Yeah, I think entirely. I think even
it's like
all the way down in the Sudan, I think they're still in French territory.
Yeah. But yeah, I was just thinking about that you never really get any sort of insight or perspective into the local characters.
Or very,
very little.
very little. You get
description, you get character description, you might even get some but no perspective,
yeah, I
no
guess is that
interiority, really.
no interiority.
Yeah.
Yeah, you even get a little interiority of the lieutenant. You get a little interiority of the American diplomat or whoever that is at the very
Yeah.
end.
And the weird mother son couple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Bel Kazim is, you don't really know anything about him. It's all viewed through Kit, but also viewed through Kit, and a Kit who's like detached from what's actually happening in a really disturbing way. We haven't talked about her. Why don't we talk about her? We kind of talked about Port a bit and sort of his philosophy and his perspective. What do you make of Kit? Because she takes over the narrative, the story anyway. The last third of the book is pretty much all about her.
Which is an interesting narrative shift because she seems very much to be the secondary character. Port drives, he's making the decisions. He keeps dragging her further and further into the desert. She doesn't seem to want to go further in the desert, but she has an affair early on with Tunner. So she's kind of like trying to get away from Port, but yet kind of remains in his control, letting herself be controlled by what his will is. And then, yeah, in the last third of the book or the last section of the book, Port has died, and she's the one who continues to survive that state of oblivion. So she enters. I think she achieves it, like that oblivion that he seeks, the sort of de-civilization, de-westernization, de-egoization,
individualization. Yeah, she becomes
de-individualization. She achieves it, and she achieves it because of his death or her rejection. She doesn't want to deal with the consequences.
Her greatest fear near the end of the book is that someone will put her in front of a mirror and she will have to see herself and what she's become.
Well, is it what she's become? Is it to see herself as what she's become in the desert, or is it to see that there's no going back, that Port's gone, and not being able to deal with the finitude of death?
It says she was convinced that this was the end, that it would not be long before they found her. They would stand her up before the great mirror, saying to her, "Look," and she would be obliged to look, and then it would be all over. The dark dream would be shattered. The light of terror would be constant. A merciless beam would be turned upon her. The pain would be unendurable and endless. Yeah, she has this fear of returning to the world.
And the world not being just the Europe or New York City or society, the world being an awareness of the world. A little bit earlier in this short passage, I don't know exactly what the context is here. As they came to a well where the women were filling their water jars, she tried to break away from him. In another minute, life would be painful. The words were coming back. And inside the wrappings of the words, there would be thoughts lying there. The hot sun would shrivel them. They must be kept inside in the dark. So she doesn't want to leave that state of de-individualized oblivion where she doesn't have to
think even.
Think.
Yeah. Early in the story, she recognizes and says something along the lines of, let's see if I can find it here. She would say, "Other people rule my life, and it was true." The "and it was true" part is not in quotations. That's from the narrative, which I find funny. But you see that in her following Port into oblivion, into what turns into, I don't know what to call it, sexual slavery, even a marriage. I think they get married or at least have some sort of ceremony.
Do they?
With Bel Kazim, isn't there like a ceremony near?
I don't think so, because he kind of like, well, he gives her all of the jewelry from his other wives.
Wasn't there a ceremony of some kind near the end?
I don't think so, unless I just read that.
Okay.
Maybe I
All right, maybe I'm
missed.
wrong. Well, essentially she becomes another one of his wives, though. So I guess the question is, why does she escape from Belkazim if she is seeking oblivion? That was a hard part for me to sort of reconcile. Like, she runs away from him, ends up in a town. It's like there's two selves battling it out inside of her. You see it when she's like unsure about whether or not she should send someone a telegram. And I guess you even see it at the very end when she agrees, almost, well, not agrees, but she goes along with being sent back to a larger city only to escape at the very end and disappear back into the chaos around her.
Well, and maybe that conflict is also that she's kind of has this conflict throughout, and her relationship with Port sort of reflects that conflict too, or her relationship with Tunner even. She goes on the train car with Tunner, kind of seems to be aware of his intentions.
Yes, and purposely gets drunk as a way to excuse her behavior, almost.
And then also leaves him, wanders to the chaos of the what is it called, the
third class car or whatever.
The third class car. Why so there's this element of chaos of, yeah, I mean, maybe, if we look at the characters, maybe Port is this deliberate pursuit of oblivion. He's single-minded in his pursuit of oblivion, or he seems to be. And then she flirts with Tunner, but then she rejects Tunner. She takes the train because she doesn't want to ride in the car, but then she leaves the train for the third class passage. So she's kind of like constantly bouncing back and forth on this spectrum between, I don't know what's the opposite end of oblivion.
Wholeness.
Wholeness, oneness, society.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is.
We live in a society.
Maybe it's reflective of her character, and when she gives up, it becomes this unthinking kind of thing being tossed around by events. There's still that kind of the alter energy.
Okay. So this kind of is going to complicate things maybe, but it's semi-related, and it's a quote that you found that you threw in our show notes here by a biographer, Alan Hibbard. It says, "In the world according to Bowles, human will is not ultimately in control. Bowles's characters, in fact, exercise remarkably little willpower. Rather than shaping their own lives, larger, unpredictable external forces determine the patterns their lives take." It's hard to see what the external forces are in this novel, other than things that are not maybe necessarily conscious to the characters.
Yeah.
But they all seem to be making choices to do things.
Well, except maybe Kit.
But still, she's making choices, right? Like, she purposely escapes Belkazim. She purposely escapes from the cab and doesn't go into the hotel at the end of the book. You never fully understand what's driving her choices. It seems like it's a choice the author is making because he has such a good control over his story and his writing. And like I mentioned earlier, you never fully go into a character's interiority completely. You're kind of just on the outside, but you get an understanding of them mostly. And I feel like with Kit, and maybe it's one of the reasons why I keep thinking about her at the end, is I have a hard time really getting a hold of her, and in terms of character motivation, if there is such a thing, other than maybe it is just madness that she's kind of flitting between these two worlds of oblivion and having some sort of will. But she finds that having a self having will to be somewhat unbearable, which is maybe why she's also someone driven by omens that she, according to
Yeah.
the last Jew in whatever town it is that she interacts with, like he kind of says, oh, maybe you're just reading these things wrong. There's the signs are good, you're just misinterpreting them. Yeah, she's always driven by some external thing, whether it's an omen, but it is internal, isn't it? I mean, her interpretation of them.
And maybe this book is more about the characters trying to escape
Choice.
that escape choice. And her choice is, I mean, Port expresses that he's driven by something that's not his, you know, by some force into the desert. And I think her choice is, to go to the third class car, to not return to civilization, and maybe escaping Belkacem is an anomaly, but certainly her choice to just like wander out into the desert. These choices all seem to be made with the intent of losing herself, of losing that responsibility of choice. And I think, and then there's moments where she seems to, certainly at the end of the novel when she's traveling with the nomads, where she does lose herself completely. So it's like this desire to turn that over. Yeah, I mean, do you think in your reading of it, do you think that does that feel like a misstep in the writing, or an inconsistency in the writing, or what do you think about that?
I think it accurately shows that there is a resistance within every person to be alive and to be their own self. So I think you see that in her. I think in Port you see it. His determination is kind of how he understands his character. And I think Kit, who was, dragged along by Port for so long, seemingly, is trying to figure out who she is. And at first it's just keep going. Keep going into nothingness.
Mm.
And part of her is resisting that because it can't help but resist it.
I think there's something very seductive about his writing, because the shift after Port dies and she wanders out into the desert, into the oasis, and starts to behave very strange. She's just like takes off her clothes, bathes in the pool, finds some nomads, insists on joining them, throws her valise on the camel, and takes off into the desert without any seeming idea about what's happening. I think in a less skilled writer, that could feel just random. Like, why did this character suddenly start behaving in this way? I mean, and not that she didn't do this something similar before, but it is kind of a shift in her character and in the narrative. But I don't know. I just kind of went with it. There's maybe there's just maybe he carries throughout the novel this element of madness.
Yeah, it's always there, I think.
And it just like suddenly comes to the fore.
You see it from the beginning. You see, even when Port goes out, follows the stranger into the tent world, meets the dancer, it's all chaotic. And you're thinking, why would anyone do this?
You're totally right.
As a reader, for me anyway, it's fun to be frustrated by these characters.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Because they're frustrating, but there's an internal consistency.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good note.
All of Port and Kit's actions are understandable for who they are in a way, but also so far removed from any action I would take as a human being.
Yeah. You wouldn't follow a stranger to the outskirts of town at midnight down a railless stairway into a Bedouin camp to possibly sleep with an underage girl?
No, can't say I would.
Um, there's to change tack somewhat, the passage where Port is dying of typhus, I thought was incredible. It's hallucinatory and strange.
Oh, where he talks about how he's trapped between two worlds.
Yeah. And the moment where I presume this is where he dies in this description of death, I find quite powerful. His cry went on through the final image, the spots of raw, bright blood on the earth, blood on excrement, the supreme moment. High above the desert, when the two elements, blood and excrement, long kept apart, merge. A black star appears, a point of darkness in the night sky's clarity, point of darkness and gateway to repose. Reach out, pierce the fine fabric of the sheltering sky, take repose. Freaking love that. That was at the end of chapter 23.
He opened his eyes. The room was malignant. It was empty. Now at last I must fight against this room. But later he had a moment of vertiginous clarity. He was at the edge of a realm where each thought, each image, had an arbitrary existence, where the connection between each thing and the next had been cut. As he labored to seize the essence of that kind of consciousness, he began to slip back into the precinct without suspecting that he was no longer wholly outside in the open, no longer able to consider the idea at a distance. There's these moments, and he mentions to Kit at some point that he's sort of trapped between two places at once.
And he's like, I don't know if I'm going to come back. First of all, there was the room. Nothing could change the hard little shell of its existence, its white plaster walls and its faintly arched ceiling, its concrete floor and its windows across which a sheet had been tacked, folded over many times to keep out the light. Nothing could change it, because that was all there was of it, that and the mattress on which he lay. When from time to time a gust of clarity swept down upon him, he opened his eyes and saw what was really there, and knew where he really was. He fixed the walls, the ceiling, and the floor in his memory, so that he could find his way back next time. For there were so many other parts of the world, so many other moments in time to be visited. He never was certain that the way back would really be there. Counting was impossible. How many hours he had been like this, lying on the burning mattress. How many times he had seen Kit stretched out on the floor nearby, had made a sound and seen her turn over, get up, and then come toward him to give him water. Things like that he could not have told, even if he had thought to ask them himself. His mind was occupied with very different problems. Sometimes he spoke aloud, but it was not satisfying. It seemed rather to hold back the natural development of the ideas. They flowed out through his mouth, and he was never sure whether they had been resolved in the right words. Words were much more alive and more difficult to handle now, so much so that Kit did not seem to understand them when he used them. They slipped into his head like the wind blowing into a room, and extinguished the frail flame of an idea forming there in the dark. Less and less he used them in his thinking. The process became more mobile. He followed the course of thoughts because he was tied on behind. Often the way was vertiginous, but he could not let go. There was no repetition in the landscape. It was always new territory, and the peril increased constantly. Slowly, pitilessly, the number of dimensions was lessening. There were fewer directions in which to move. It was not a clear process. There was nothing definite about it, so that he could say, now up is gone. Yet he had witnessed occasions when two different dimensions had deliberately, spitefully merged their identities, as if to say to him, try and tell which is which. His reaction was always the same, a sensation in which the outer part of his being rushed inward for protection. The same movement one sometimes sees in a kaleidoscope on turning it very slowly. when the parts of the design fall headlong into the center. But the center, sometimes it was gigantic, painful, raw, and false. It extended from one side of creation to the other. There was no telling where it was. It was everywhere. And sometimes it would disappear. And the other center, the true one, the tiny burning black point, would be there in its place, unmoving and impossibly sharp, hard and distant. And each center he called that. He knew one from the other, and which was the true, because when, for a few minutes sometimes, he actually came back to the room and saw it, and saw Kit, and said to himself, I am in Spa. He could remember the two centers and distinguish between them, even though he hated them both. And he knew that the one, which was only there, was the true one, while the other was wrong, wrong, wrong.
It really is a descent into, kind of like you said, C.S. Lewis's idea of hell being absolute isolation, like true loneliness.
Yeah, and that this sort of like recognizing, oh, there's these two that's, these two bases of reality. One of them is the true base reality, and the other is the wrong base reality.
So when he's coming in and out of consciousness, and I found what he says to her, and it says, but his words made her miserable. It was like hearing him recount one of his dreams, worse even. And this is in quotes. So alone, I can't even remember the idea of not being alone, he was saying. His fever would go up. I can't even think what it would be like for there to be someone else in the world. When I'm there, I can't remember being here. I'm just afraid. But here, I can remember being there. I wish I could stop remembering it. It's awful to be two things at once. You know that, don't you? His hand sought hers desperately. You do know that. You understand how awful it is. You've got to. She let him take her hand. And then a page later is when he finally actually dies. And here, this goes back to what we were talking about very early on. It was not a whole life whose loss she was mourning there in his arms, but it was a great part of one. Above all, it was a part whose limits she knew precisely, and her knowledge augmented the bitterness. And presently within her, deeper than the weeping for the wasted years, she found a ghastly dread, all formed and growing. She raised her head and looked up at him with tenderness and terror. His head had dropped to one side. His eyes were closed. She put her arms around his neck and kissed his forehead many times. Then, half pulling and half coaxing, she got him back down into bed and covered him. She gave him his pill, undressed silently, and lay down facing him, leaving the lamp burning so she could... And then it ends with the chapter. The wind at the window celebrated her dark sensation of having attained a new depth of solitude. You see him actually experiencing it, and it is a living hell for him in his dying moments. And yet, for her, it's referred to as a ghastly dread, but yet, the wind at the window celebrated her dark sensation of having attained a new depth of solitude. So she recognizes that she is now even more alone. And there's some fear that pushes her further and further.
Yeah, it's almost like he, in this sort of psychedelic suffering, warns her what solitude is, what true solitude is. And yet, the final section of the book is her own pursuit of that true solitude.
Yeah. And you would think that at the end of the novel, it's moving in a way that's almost seemingly expected for her to return to society in some way, even if she is shattered. But at the very end, you're left with two hotel porters shaking their head, going, weren't we supposed to help someone into the room?
Yeah.
And you never see her again. You just The way he
Yeah.
describes just the tram disappearing into the city is so awesome. It's so awesome.
It's so good. And she doesn't appear again.
No, she literally is lost into it. She vanishes.
Do you want to read just the last sentence of the book?
I mean, honestly, that whole last paragraph is pretty amazing.
A few minutes later, two men walked out to the waiting cab. They looked inside, glanced up and down the sidewalk. Then they spoke questioningly to the driver, who shrugged his shoulders. At that moment, a crowded streetcar was passing by, filled largely with native dock workers in blue overalls. Inside it, the dim lights flickered, the standees swayed. Rounding the corner and clanging its bell, it started up the hill past the Café Dec Moule Noiseau, where the awnings flapped in the evening breeze, past the Bar Metropole, with its radio that roared, past the Café de Francais, shining with mirrors and brass. Noisily it pushed along, cleaving a passage through the crowd that filled the street. It scraped around another corner and began the slow ascent of the Avenue Gallieni. Below, the harbor lights came into view and were distorted in the gently moving water. Then the shabbier buildings loomed. The streets were dimmer. At the edge of the Arab quarter, the car, still loaded with people, made a wide U-turn and stopped. It was the end of the line.
I love that he upends expectations. First, by not having her return to the world, and then second, in that last paragraph, by never mentioning her again. I think it's brilliant, actually.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's clear what happened. She slipped off into the third-class car again. But on the other hand, the way that he writes it, it kind of transcends that. It's almost like she neither did nor did not. There's always these two forces. There's the force that returns you to civilization. There's the force that takes you back to whatever. I don't know what it is that she's pursuing, but the force that takes you back to the other end. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about Paul Bowles' Sheltering Sky. Please, as always, remember to like and subscribe to us wherever you listen to podcasts. That really helps us to find new listeners and helps people find the podcast. Next up, we are going to be reading Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. I hope you'll join us and read this book along with us. If you haven't purchased it yet, I hope you'll consider supporting the podcast and making your purchase through our affiliate links on booksofsomesubstance.com. Until next time, happy reading.